Hi, this is Privateer Station, and today we continue the topic of a special political aspect of this war. There are different fractions in the Russian opposition to Putin's regime. You heard earlier a snippet from the left. This is the one from the right. It echoes some of the American right views on that subject. However, I should preclude and say that MTG and Trump Jr.'s post against Ukraine are very not in favor with that group. If Putin's orcs continue to think that with American right winning they will get a respite, they should think twice. The original interview was streamed on July 8th of this summer, and here Mark Feygin is interviewing Andrey Illarionov. Andrey is a Russian economist and former senior policy advisor to Vladimir Putin from April 2000 to December 2005. Since April 2021, he is a senior fellow at the non-governmental organization Center for Security Policy, which is based out of Washington, D.C. in the United States. Since leaving his role in the government of Russian Federation, he became a critic of Putin's administration and particularly his stance on foreign relations, as well as energy doctrines and other economic aspects. Without further ado, enjoy. Dear friends, glad to see you all on Feygin Live. We are continuing our Friday evening conversations. It is 8th of July, and we have a new stream. We have a special guest today, Andrey Nikolayevich Illarionov. Andrey, glad to see you. Good evening, Mark. Good evening, our viewers. We named this stream Waiting for Lend Lease. And we wanted to talk to you because this subject is a somewhat key point. We have addressed it, we have been turning to it during the last several weeks, and it probably would be very appropriate to discuss it with you. We have about 8,000 people who joined us at the moment. 2,000 of them clicked the like button. The usual ask, please share links to that stream on your social media. Perhaps send it to other people via your messengers. Help us increase the audience. And of course, subscribe to Feygin Live and to the Privateer Station if you are listening or watching that in English language. Help us continue bringing these news from a different perspective. Andrey Nikolayevich, there are different evaluations of how this campaign works and how this campaign flows in Ukraine about the level of support, level of effort to support Ukraine with the Western armaments. Of course, and it's obvious that Western armor, Western weapons, they do have a huge effect on the capabilities for Ukraine to resist. And even the latest successful hits on logistical chains of Russian army in Donbass they do prove that these new weapons are very important, and the presence of them on the front guarantee or do not guarantee or guarantee the other outcome if they're absent. So one of the key questions is Lend Lease. It seems to be resolved on one hand. On the other hand, it still is in discussion. And it's a standard question that many people are asking. When will then Lend Lease happen? What would be the quantities and how it will affect the flow of this war and the occupation of Ukrainian territories annexed and captured by Putin's regime? Will these weapons be able to help Ukraine preclude Russia from capturing the entire territory of this country? How would you address that? Mark, you touched upon a very wide circle of subjects. Each of them deserves a separate, serious discussion. We will try to address some of them during today's conversation. The first one that I would want to address is the term of war in Ukraine. I think the term should be changed. I think this is a Russian-Ukrainian war, and the theater where the war happens can differ. War in Ukraine is a term that is used widely in Europe, in America, and in Russia, by the way, very often by people who support Putin. Putin Verstehen, as they call them in Europe. What do you think in this war in Ukraine? What is in it that supports Putin? This is the term used by those who support Putin's regime, who are trying to somewhat box the scope of this war. Look at those people on the Putin's press staff. They usually say special military operation in Ukraine. They are trying to limit the geographical locale to Ukraine, and they're also trying to concentrate and reorient people's attention that everything related to that is pointing to Ukraine. Russia is sort of out of the scope, even in the name, and it's all about Ukraine and Ukrainian inner situation. It is a very well-weighted approach. They invented this term for a reason. And the authors of the article that was signed later by Joe Biden and was published in the New York Times early on, that was a strategic program article. It was written by the part of American administration that stands against helping Ukraine. And that article was entitled, What I Will Do in Ukraine and What America Will Not Do in Ukraine. This is a wrong approach. The war, at least, is Russian-Ukrainian war. And at large, first of all, because it's understandable who is an aggressor, who is the victim of that aggression. But if you look at large at the current situation, at the new stage of this war, this is a coalition war. Aggressor got an ally, Belarus. So right now, at least, it's a coalition of two countries, of two aggressors. And on the side of a victim, while military is Ukrainian, but financial, humanitarian, and military help is being provided by a wide group of allies that are helping Ukraine to resist in that conflict. So this is a war between two coalitions, coalition of aggressors and coalition of people defending the victim. So is it fair to say it's a world war? No, not yet. The world war is usually a term used to the conflicts, is usually applied to the conflicts where most population of the world is involved in the warring sides, or where most of the military production is located. So far it is a coalition war. This is a war of two groups, of two coalitions. It's understood that the degree of participation of some allies on one side differs from the degree of participation of the allies on the other side. But in this light, a term a war in Ukraine is a wrong name for that conflict. Because, first of all, even though we do understand that situation happen, most of fighting is going in Ukraine, we do read about events happening in the territory of Belarus, in Millerva, in Belgorod, and Bryansk. These territories are not Ukraine territories. So, in my opinion, the minimal acceptable name for this conflict, who is not even trying to give a pro-Ukrainian point of view, but just an objective point of view, this is a Russian-Ukrainian war. A proper one would, a more detailed would be a coalitional war between aggressors and a coalition that defends the victim, the defendant. This is my first consideration to start with. Second one, when you and I talk about Lend Lease, however it would be, if it would be, this is part of military help. So it would be good to speak about military help in general and what kind of support is being given to Ukraine, what kind of support do they need, what can be provided to them in this time frame. These are the questions that I would highlight. And it would be important to understand the core of this Russian-Ukrainian war. The character of this coalitional war. We talked about the fact that this character changed. It started as a blitzkrieg and it failed. It's not what Kremlin was concocting at the beginning. Right now it is the war for exhaustion. That war has very specific characteristics that differ it from a special military operation from blitzkrieg. This is a long-term conflict that will involve all possible resources: military, demographic, economic, financial, other resources. This is the war till one of the sides will fold, till one of the sides will fail to withstand this cruel conflict. That brings a question to light: what parameters, which of them are the most important? There are three key parameters we can highlight. Each of them are not in static position, they are always in flux, but we can pinpoint them. So first is the will to win, the will to fight, and the will to continue. The second one is the quantity of resources available for both sides. And the third is effectiveness of use of these resources. Up until this moment, we have a somewhat limited data on these parameters, but regardless, speaking of the first one, about the will to continue, military conflict, both sides display that parameter, both sides are willing to continue. Second one, we can probably gauge by the amount of losses by one side and the other side. In the first month or two, general advantage was on the Ukrainian side. The effectiveness of use of Ukraine military was much higher than the effectiveness of the use of Russian military, including those so-called corps from TNR and LNR, those fake republics, probably in 3 times different. Recent months, late spring, early summer, displayed that the effectiveness probably changed and the disparity between losses did diminish. So, in this case, the main question that will answer who will win in a long-term conflict is resources. What resources do these two coalitions have? This is not even military mathematics, that's military arithmetics. We can take a look at the resources that both sides started with at the beginning of this conflict and what do they have now. If we take a look at the data published for 24th of February 2022, this data is somewhat approximate. Always, we cannot be 100% informed about every detail. However, in military troops, Russia, actually in demographic aspect, warring coalition of Russia and Belarus was about 4 times bigger than Ukraine. If we look at the demographic resource, at people who can carry arms, who can bear arms and who can fight, the proportion is about 10 to 1. If we look at the tanks, armored vehicles, artillery, of course, not a full exact picture, but the relation is about 10 or 12 to 1. In airplanes and helicopters, it's about 15 to 1. In missiles and strategic aviation, one understands that absolute advantage is on the side of the aggressor. Ukraine doesn't have nukes or missiles of a strategic character. It doesn't have strategic aviation, or it has very minimal resources that are incomparable with what Russia had. This is what was at the beginning, how it was at the beginning of this conflict. Then there goes a process of death and destruction of these resources in the course of war. And we can take a look at the pace of that destruction on each of those sides. Some of this data is being regularly published by experts and by representatives of military forces. Recently, Vice Minister of Defense of Ukraine published that, according to their data, in some of the military aspects, some of the nomenclature, Ukraine lost from 50 to 30% of their equipment. And we understand that losses in Russia, losses of Ukraine, and estimations differ. There is estimation from Great Britain Intel, estimation from US Intel, but even if this correlation of losses between the coalition of aggressors and military of Ukraine is 3 to 1. If we just take it that for every unit of equipment lost on the Ukrainian side is followed by the loss of 3 units lost on the Russian side, or Russian coalition side, then at a start correlation of 10 to 1, in tanks, in armored vehicles, in artillery, anyone can do that simple math and calculations on the napkin. With the time flows, that correlation will change in favor of aggressor. To save the initial proportion, even in military resources, it is important to keep that ratio of losses at least 10 to 1. If that ratio is more than 10 to 1, then defender limits or diminishes that gap. If the correlation is lesser than 10 to 1, then the defender is weakening as the war goes. And we can compare that in relation to actual numbers of fighters, of people on the ground. The outcome will be the same. What it leads to us to, what that mathematics is leading us to, is very simple. That's why some aggressors who have a significant advantage over the defender, they actually prefer the war for exhaustion, because when they have overwhelming resource advantage, the waste of these resources that are unacceptable for many other countries, and very often the defending country, is rather acceptable for an aggressor, because overall the resources of a defender diminish much faster and much quicker than aggressor. The same calculation was done by Stalin when he attacked Finland in 1939. The population of the Soviet Union at that time was about 200 million people. The population of Finland was about 3.6 million people. And of course, parameters of military resources would be understandably similar, and maybe even worse, because Finland also lacked similar economic resource, and they were not preparing for the same scale of war in tanks and aviation and other offensive weapons. And that was the calculation of Stalin. And although Finns, according to the data we have, they actually succeeded in getting losses, or ratio of losses of an aggressor to a defender were 5 to 1, even 7 to 1. These are very impressive results, showing much higher effectivity of Finland military forces. The problem was that overall number of military resources in Finland's possession was much smaller than the resources of Soviet Union, and they were fading away much faster. So Stalin had that calculation in his mind, and radical change in that situation happened when Stalin got a message that France and Great Britain, which abstained for 105 days from direct participation in Soviet-Finland war, Winter War of 1939-1940, started loading their expeditionary corps that was going to be sent to Narvik and then redirected to territory of Finland from there to participate in military activities on the territory of Finland. The moment Stalin got that message, he made the right and the only possible conclusion at this moment. He can defeat Finland, but he cannot defeat Finland, supported by UK and France. So Stalin immediately sent a message to Finnish officials that he is eager to conduct negotiations. And after that, there was a famous treaty signed. A peace treaty was signed. So if to extrapolate that to the current situation in Ukraine, we understand that resources ratio of Ukraine to resources ratio in Russia are bigger than what Finland had back in those days to Soviet Union. But the war continues already longer than the Finnish conflict of winter 1939-1940. Ukraine was preparing to some of that war, probably better than Finland did back in the day. But today, Ukraine, a lot of the resources that they have are very close to being depleted. I'm not saying they're at zero, but even if they're at 30 or 40%, that's already a significant drop in capabilities. In this case, continuation of effective armed struggle with an enemy who is overwhelmingly stronger, the victim of aggression can continue only if the victim is getting a very substantial military help. And that military help should be not provided in general, overall in that year, not by Christmas, not sometime in autumn, but is being provided daily, weekly. Now, the next question is, how much of that military help do the allies of Ukraine need to transfer to Ukraine in order to let Ukraine continue that armed resistance? You can do some of these calculations as well. And some military experts were already trying to gauge how many artillery howitzers of 150 millimeter caliber, how many HIMARS, what air defense system are needed. We hear a lot of conversations about that. This is a normal thing, and military experts are doing a very important thing, clearing the exact types of arms that are required on the front at this moment. However, if we extrapolate from that, if we look at the larger picture, how much would Ukraine need? The other parameter, besides monetary value of that equipment, we don't really have other parameter to gauge it with. But every weapon, every armor, every jet, every artillery has a cost, has a price. But still, and they differ, of course, but using that aggregate number, we can see the overall possibility to success for the defender. And we see that in the long war for exhaustion, both sides, from what we know, need to somewhat be on the same level. It doesn't need to be exactly equal. If one side has a much higher effectivity, much higher effectiveness of use of their military on the battlefield, these numbers can be different. But if the armies fighting each other are at a similar technological level and a similar preparation level, they differ, but they're still somewhat the same. It's not a difference between British troops in Omdurman in, I think, 1886, when British troops had 4 machine guns Maxim against several tens of thousands of Arab cavalry, and these 4 machine guns solved the conflict in several hours. So we're not facing that situation. In this case, when the armies are somewhat on the same level, price estimation may be of a great help to understand the perspectives and outcomes. Especially since May of this year, official expenses, military expenses of Russia were classified, so we don't have anything fresher than May. But according to the early months of war, that campaign cost them about $10 billion per month. In April, it did cost them $10 billion converted from Russian ruble figure. Again, this is the official number that they had published at that time. They are not including the use of warehouse equipment. So that was already produced, they don't need to make it again. So a separate task is to provide a cost analysis of those tools and equipment and missiles that are being used from the warehouses. Because these expenses have already happened in earlier periods, but they're being used now. So this is a complex part of that estimation. Western experts did look into that, and it is rather popular now in the Western media that Russia is spending about $900 million worth daily on the military actions in Ukraine, against Ukraine. If that number is correct, then $900 million a day is about $27 billion per month. We can use that estimate. I'm using a more modest calculation. I'm thinking about $500 million a day and probably $15 billion per month. The difference between $15 and $27 billion is probably a more realistic number between what they waste actually at war and what they are sending from the warehouses. Right now we know that they're transferring some of the warehouses' contents from Belarus to Russia. Yeah, he gave them the ammo and other things. So one can provide a costly analysis. How much were they? And Belarus is expecting to be compensated for that. So there is a cost, there is a price on each shell. And regardless, we do have two numbers, between $15 to $27 billion per month. How much does Ukraine spend? Recently, Prime Minister Shmyhal gave an interview where he quoted a number to the military expenses of Ukraine in May. In transfer to dollar, if converted to dollar, it's about $4 billion. $4 billion against 15 or against 27. That's at least 3.5 times. At the minimal, it's almost 4 times. At the max, it's up to 7-8 times differ. So, if it is a blitzkrieg, if it's a short-term war, then a much more important role is played by timely actions, by some military maneuvers, by other decisions on the front that can compensate for lack of resources and lack of equipment in both sides. But if it is a war for exhaustion, where both sides are not making huge mistakes, and we're seeing that Russian side took lessons from the first months, and they're much more effective in the way they're fighting now than they did in the beginning of this war. So at this point is when we need to provide at least comparable support from both sides, comparable resources from the side of defender in order to be able to defend from offensive party. I'll give another example. This is another war that has a lot of materials written about that. During the first 4 years of the Second World War, from 1939 to 1942, coalition of aggressors, the Axis, and up to the first part of 41, it included Germany, Italy, and Japan. And Stalin's Soviet Union was also part of the Axis up until the summer of 1941. Since the summer of that year, Soviet Union changed sides, but until that moment, it belonged to the aggressing group. So in those years, coalition of aggressors was spending 6 to 7 times more than all the military expenses of the victims of that aggression. And that was one of the bases, one of the conditions why aggressor had such a military advantage, and how they managed to conquer so many countries in Europe and in Asia, aggressor in faces of Germany, Italy, Soviet Union, and Japan. When did that proportion change? It changed only in 1943. Only when that coalition, anti-Hitler coalition, was joined by United States of America, and even with participation of United States, the coalition needed at least 2 years to grow their military expenses to create that military production and expanded nomenclature that had a scale comparable to the military production of the Axis, and then to prevail over that. And if we look at when the core shift happened in the Second World War, according to different materials, it's either the end of 1942 or beginning of 1943. That highlights that these military financial calculations are a very important predictor, pointing at possible changes and the outcomes on the battlefront. It is not guaranteed, but they create a very important condition for such a change. And understandably, in 1944, that ratio was bigger, and in 1945, it became overwhelming. And everything ended in 1945. So, coming back to our problem at hand, in order to provide at least military parity, and that's what military experts for the most part are talking about, having military parity on the battlefield, at least to approach that, to be able to be equal on the battlefield. We're not talking about active offensive campaigns, but just to approach that, you need to understand that correlation 4 to 15 or 4 to 27 is very far from that parity. So one of the first conclusions one can make from that is a necessity of military supplies to Ukraine from allies. There is another problem here, hidden in these $4 billion that Ukraine spends. That is about 30% of Ukraine GDP. Of today Ukraine GDP, after it shrunk at the beginning of war, after the territory was occupied, so it's about at 30%. This possibly can be grown a little bit, but not too much, because there are some economic limits. How much can you grow military expenses even in days of war? For example, most parts of the countries that fought in the Second World War had this number at about 50, 45, 52%. So one can grow that a little in the Ukraine scenario, but not too much. In Russia, it's probably about 10 to 12% of GDP, and Russia can continue increasing these military expenses. They have pretty substantial reserve if they want to. So accordingly, that difference, if we're talking about how much Ukraine needs, that number of $15 billion expenses in military arms, if we make analog calculations to the Second World War, that would mean that allies would need to supply materials, equipment, ammo to about $11 billion to match $15 billion total monthly. And that's only to provide parity of the military financial terms with the aggressor. And that's if we take the lower bracket. If we take the higher limit, $27 billion, then the demand in military equipment and other supplies and materials grows to, and you can calculate how much. If Russia does mobilization successfully and does economic mobilization when they switch to military production, and there are some signs that they're already doing that. Yes, they already made certain legal documents and administrative switch to a 3-shift production. So there are some changes happening there. We cannot rely on the minimal needs that we outlined for Ukraine. If it is a war for exhaustion, we need to understand that we also need to be ready for that serious side of war. The war is probably the most serious problem that we can face in this life. But at the bare minimal level of military supplies, military support that Ukraine needs from allies is at least $11 billion monthly. Next question is logical. How much do the allies actually provide? Recently, there were published data for the last 4 months and 1 week. Until the 1st of July, all support that Ukraine received is slightly over $20 billion. And I need to talk about that. I need to mention one more thing. They say it's support, but in English language it's called authorization. So it is approval to supply. In legal documents, it would be written off as help provided, but it doesn't mean that they actually received that help. And it doesn't mean that this equipment was loaded, was transported, or even or delivered to the military on the front. So that number includes all that. Germany recently authorized several billion dollars worth of equipment, for example, but out of these numbers, they only supplied physically 35%. Not exactly the same ratio, but very similar proportion is related to the supplies provided by United States and other allies. Very often it's not even military equipment, very often it's including additional support, and also we need to understand that, regardless, it doesn't mean that they received everything. But even if we forget about that, $20 billion overall support means that Ukraine got $5 billion on average monthly. And even that number is about twice smaller, 2.5 times smaller than what Ukraine actually should be provided in order to get closer to the military financial parity and then to military parity on the front. If the proper estimation of expenses of Russia is indeed 900 millions per day, then this lag between Ukrainian and Russian monetary and economic capabilities in this war just growing. So these volumes then need to be increased much higher in order to support Ukraine. This outlines how important is the question of today's military military supplies to Ukraine, and they are vital indeed, yes, but what we're doing now, they're not even enough to continue supporting military parity on the battlefront. All right, we have about 51,000 people watching us, over 12,000 click the like button. We've been live for about 37 minutes. I have to let you know that in 20 minutes we'll have another stream with Alexey Arestovich, and please continue sharing links in your accounts and social media, and of course subscribe to Feygin Live. So this is a very convincing set of numbers, Andrey. You have done a lot of work, and the first conclusion out of that material that you supplied is that military support of Ukraine is much weaker than it should be in order to ensure Ukrainian victory in this war. Second is what of interest to us, and that is closer to the topic of this show. Can Lend Lease program change that relation? Because Lend Lease, as we know about it, it considers the possible supply of arms from the United States, if we are talking about the program, straight from production, not from warehouses, but actually from fresh production, in the necessary quantities, according to requests of military command, I guess. However, they discuss that nomenclature. But in any case, that would be some sort of fresh new product of the military-industrial complex that could help Ukraine to solve these problems. It can solve it quantitatively or qualitatively, because we understand that there are some weapons that are promised, for example, air defense systems, some MLRS systems like HIMARS that significantly changed situation of relation of forces and capabilities on the front. Not in quantitative, but definitely in qualitative. Russian military is definitely lagging behind the West for many reasons. They're using a lot of old Soviet technology or somewhat post-Soviet, but a lot of different weapons that are not competitive with their Western analogs. So we're trying to understand, would Lend Lease program cover that disparity or not? Mark, you know, among different questions that are related to today's war, the question that is shrouded in most fog is probably a Lend-Lease question. Oh, please dispel that fog if you can. Yeah, let me use that stream to try to address that. At least to dispel some of these legends and mythology. Because I have to say that in many streams, including many of people whom you bring here to talk about this issue, I think, from what I hear, how they address it, they were propagating some of these myths. I don't think from any evil intention, but probably by misunderstanding of the nature of that program. For example, there was a myth initially, when will the supply provided by Lend Lease will start happening. And there were some talks in Russian media. They actually were injecting that it might happen only from the new fiscal year that starts on the 1st of October. So this part is not even myth, it's disinformation. Because Lend Lease law doesn't have any time attached to that. That law covers only 2 years, 2022 and 2023 fiscal years. Fiscal 22 started on the 1st of October 21 and finishes on the end of September of this year, so we're living through that fiscal. And fiscal 23 starts in October, 1st of October 22 and goes on the next year. So since both years are included, there are no limits to not use Lend Lease program right now. So there's no need to wait for autumn or any other month. Okay, that's good. And second, what can be expected from Lend Lease? Short answer, probably nothing. Like, seriously, nothing. You mentioned HIMARS, air defense systems, other tools. Very likely none of these will be provided due to Lend Lease, because in the law that was adopted in the United States by legislature and that was signed by Biden on the 9th of May this year, it has not a single number. It has no quantifier or qualifier of any military help that should be provided to Ukraine. There is no definition of what weapons are to be provided to Ukraine at all. There is only one phrase, content-worthy phrase in that law, that Congress of the United States of America affords President of the United States the right to create mechanisms that diminish bureaucratic bottlenecks and to provide for expedited support of arms to Ukraine. That's it. And Congress puts that responsibility onto the US President to expedite that process in 6 days. So if Biden signed that law into action on the 9th of May, by 9th of July, today is already 8th of July. Oh, so they give him, 30 days. So by the end of today, he should have already implemented these measures and reported back to Congress and to senators and to US public at large what was done in order to expedite military support to Ukraine using other channels and other means. Not on Lend Lease channel, because that law doesn't really include a way to support any military. That is why the Lend Lease we're talking about today differs so much from Lend Lease that was signed into action by the initiative of President Roosevelt, and which he used very actively during the Second World War. That is what he was lobbying the Congress for, to provide the maximum help for Great Britain, which at that time was, early on in the Second World War, was the only country effectively resisting the aggression of the Axis. We do not see anything similar here. We do not see a specific desire from the current President of the United States to even sign that law, because he was not the initiator of that law. That law was initiated by a group of 10 Republican senators, which I think back in 20th of January of this year brought that project to Senate for voting, with a request, with a demand to provide additional pressure onto administration in order to make it do something to help Ukraine. We need to remind that 19th of January, that was at least a month before the hot phase of this war, before the last attack of Putin started. Nobody knew for sure that it would happen, but since senators were worried about the way situation will go, and they saw that administration was not doing much, they prepared such a legislature to provide additional pressure onto administration from the standpoint of helping Ukraine. We know that this law was put in the table until April by another party, which did not like that proposal. Then we know that at the beginning of April, this law was adopted by Senate. Then it was given to Congress. Congress, led by Ms. Pelosi, the leader of Democratic Party, one of the leaders, was installing for about a month. Then at the end of it, it was voted for, was given to Biden. And then Biden also slow-walked that to, according to our current norm, such as legislature that was adopted by both chambers, Senate and Congress, should be signed by President in 7, maximum 10 days. Biden signed it on the 11th. So later we see what was happening with that law that was signed. Has ever Mr. Biden used, in his speeches or in his commentary, in his answers to different questions, has he ever used the name of that project, Lend Lease? Has he ever mentioned it during the whole war that was happening since February, or during the time when this legislature was still being reviewed by Congress or Senate? What do you mean publicly? Any use, any public use. We have not found a single use of Lend Lease by Biden. The other law about $40 billion, and that was discussed a lot and was in limelight in the last couple of months, that was mentioned regularly. In essence, actually, it started with the $33 billion that he initially proposed, and Congress added another 7, and it became an additional help to aid to Ukraine, a $40 billion package. That was mentioned regularly, that he addressed regularly in his speeches. Lend Lease, he never addressed, not a single time. Head of Pentagon, Lloyd Austin, has he ever used the term Lend Lease? The answer is no, never. Even in Ramstein, the third Ramstein that happened, they had 3, the last one was in Brussels, and They talked about different aid versions to Ukraine, monetary, military. Has the term been ever used? No, never. Has Secretary of State Blinken used that? The answer is not, never. Press secretaries of Biden or Psaki or Jean-Pierre is now. Has any of these press secretaries of our president or press secretaries of Pentagon used that? The answer is no, never. So in other words, in the first almost half a year since that legislature was brought to Senate of United States of America, not a single functionary of the current administration of the United States has used in their speeches, in their public answers, or addresses or documents the term Lend Lease. Why am I speaking about that? And where am I going to? I'm saying that if this law has never been used in public rhetoric of the leader of American administration, this is probably a very good evidence of administration relation to that law. And I have a very big concern that this law will ever be used by this administration. I would be glad to be wrong. I would be glad to be mistaken. And if I am mistaken, I will with pleasure acknowledge that. But from what we see now, we see there is no numeric value to this law. There is no dictation to send a certain amount of how much and when will be sent or should be sent, or there has to be some formula. For example, it's probably impossible for the United States, but for such term, under these conditions, there is a credit line to be opened that allows to United States head, president, or Pentagon or secretary or somebody to send that much help to Ukraine or authorize a certain amount of help to Ukraine. Since it doesn't exist, since none of the representatives of administration talked about that, since that legislature was brought up by the party which is in opposition to the current administration, I have a very deep concern that this law will ever be used. Okay, we have not much time left. We're about 52 minutes live, and it's 9:52 p.m. We have 59,000 and a half watching us, about a third click the like button. Let's get to some conclusions. From your words, mostly skeptical about Lend Lease as a tool for military support to Ukraine, one can make certain conclusions. What conclusions do you think are to be made? Does it mean that American administration, US administration is not ready to provide enough help to create that parity in the war? Or is it inner political situation, perhaps on the verge of looming elections later this year? And maybe it has some influence that American administration is not really exploiting I'm sorry, that the Biden is not talking about that. Do you think there is any conclusion to be made? Or do you think that law is just a framework that just frames that supplies that are already going? One cannot deny that the United States is already supporting Ukraine to a significant degree. So what conclusion do you think should be made? Signed with such an announcement, it was signed and it's supposed to be executed, right? Because if they won't, that will probably beg for different reactions. What conclusions should we make here? First of all, I need to say that it was not pompously signed. It was not very loudly signed. When Biden was signing 40 billion aid to Ukraine, there was a lot of media press presence. Yeah. I remember he used the same pen that Roosevelt, Jen Psaki was commenting. But signing Lend Lease happened without any fanfare, without cameras, without commentary. It was just announced that it was signed. He never said anything about Lend Lease. That's basically the confirmation of what I'm trying to highlight here, that this document was signed, was put on a shelf, and will probably die there on a shelf. Aid that is being given to Ukraine by United States is being given via different channels. So that $40 billion aid, we talked that out of these 40, Ukraine only gets 17. 23 is to United States and other countries. Out of those 17, only 6 billion is military help. And the first portion of 650 million was indeed sent a couple of weeks ago. So that's all they got out of this so far. There was another law that was adopted earlier, and some of the military help was being done in the framework of that other law. And a lot of help that comes now, that is coming to Ukraine from states, is coming via drawdown authority. That is the right that the President of the United States has to use military surplus, military tools present on the warehouses of American military, and provide these warehoused items to this side of conflict that helps in the long run, in the bigger perspective, to the United States and to the world we live in. So initially it started as a trickle, now it's growing, but as that program, that's what exactly the president is using. So he's using a different channel to send military help to Ukraine. This one is a major of them. Now, the question we are posing here is, how is that help enough? Is that reflective of what Ukraine actually needs? Do we meet the demand? And if United States and other countries who are allies of Ukraine, are they meeting the mark? Because if they were, the number would be growing 3-4 times. But as we see now, we barely supply 20 or 25% of what America was spending in the last 20 years in Afghanistan, Syria, and Iraq. So in the last 20 years, the United States spent over $8 trillion to wage these wars. So United States, if we spent at least a quarter of what we were spending there monthly, we would have achieved all parity in Ukraine. If we spent about a fourth or a fifth of what United States were spending in the last 20 years non-stop. So monthly figure would be close to 300 million, and then 70 would be a fraction of that. So that we're talking about what we've been doing in the United States. We've been doing that, providing that support to our military efforts for the last 20 years. So it is not an improbable thing for the United States to provide that help. It's not even an increase in what we've been doing all the time. Now, I have seen some of the recent leaks from Pentagon's report to the Congress of the United States. And that report was about the value of arms that they left in Afghanistan after they left it to Taliban. The value is over $7 billion. There is a number of airplanes, transport planes like Hercules, the ones that U.S. administration is not currently supplying to Ukraine. Overall number of vehicles supplied to Afghanistan is about 96,000. Nobody is talking how much trucks U.S. supplied to Ukraine. Remember, we talked a lot about howitzers. So Ukraine got right now probably 30-40 of those. Afghanistan got 176 overall. So if you take overall military aid that United States is providing to Afghanistan, it's about $88 billion. It's very incomparable number of what is given to Ukraine. And of that, military equipment, ammo, and other things that were supplied to Afghanistan included $18.6 billion, so 3 times more than what is being supplied to Ukraine. If we recalculate that for one troop, for one serviceman, it means that every one Afghanistan soldier received 10 times more equipment, more weapons than Ukrainian military servicemen. Not even talking about nomenclature differences and not talking about the nature of military action that was performed, that was carried out in Afghanistan from the nature of war happening in Ukraine. Okay, we are at a limit. We are at 10 p.m. Time for me to start another stream, but we'll find a way to invite you here again. It was a very important conversation. 65,000 people are watching us, and about 20,000 likes were clicked. Please do not forget to share, like, and subscribe, and follow other streams. We'll continue that with Alexey Arestovich and maybe touch upon these topics. I gotta run. Thank you a lot, Andrey Nikolayevich. Thank you, Mark. Talk later.